morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Environmental Social Justice. I'm your host, Wendy Nystrom, and today's special guest is Christopher Spengler. He is the founder of Spengler Strategies. So welcome to the show, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Anytime. So today's, good morning, yes. Today's going to be a little special. It's going to be kind of a story time because Chris and I bonded over phase ones and everything that can go wrong if you do it cheaply. Hence the title, The Pitfalls of a Cheap Phase One Report. So Chris, could you just explain real quickly what your background is?
Sure. I've been an environmental consultant based in San Diego for 31 years and counting. Most of my work's been in San Diego, but I've been doing a lot of work in LA too. So I can do anything in Southern California, or maybe further away from that. My claim to fame is being the project manager for the Petco Park and East Village redevelopment project back in the late 90s, early 2000s. That included a 36 city block phase one, and for me, a 19 city block remediation with a $7.8 million price tag. I established Spengler Strategies in 2014 to provide higher value service to clients, to provide what I call whole project strategies to developers, wherein the assessment work includes the construction process for managing contaminated soil and the health risk and regulatory issues too. I was the construction after forming CSS, Spengler Strategies. I was the construction manager for the $33 million remediation of the 21-acre steel mill site. That's part of the $1 billion Jordan Downs redevelopment project in Watts.
Oh, wow.
That was 20 months of being up in LA. I specialize in addressing soil contamination during the redevelopment process.
Very important tactic.
To maximize efficiencies and reduce costs.
So I just want to let people know real quick, when we talk about environmental site assessments or phase ones, it's basically when you go to a site that is going to be developed or purchased or sold, you as the new buyer want to make sure whether or not that property is contaminated. Because when you buy that property, you are legally liable for everything on it and under it. So the phase one, and Chris, please correct me, it's been about 20 years since I've done one. You basically walk the site and you're looking around for evidence of contamination or evidence of storage of chemicals or materials that could be problematic. If you see that, then you have to kind of go to a phase two where you pop some holes in the ground and you look for that contamination. And what Chris is saying is the Petco Park, that's in San Diego. That's the baseball park, kind of in the heart of San Diego. So you actually, Chris, could you tell the history of what that site was? Because it was pretty interesting of what it was before it was Petco.
Okay, well, there's a lot of things. As you can imagine, it's actually the redevelopment was a 26 blocks. And the reason I only addressed 19 was because the remainder blocks were owned by SDG&E. And SDG&E created a manufactured gas plant in 1870 down there. Manufactured gas plant is a nasty business of taking oil or coal, and they switch back and forth between the two. And they heat it up until it cracks. And the crack releases the petroleum as a gas. They collect that gas, and it has all kinds of particulates in it that have to be scrubbed out. And that gas was fed through the city for heat and for gas lamps, as in the gas lamp
district.
All right. Basically, it was used the way we use natural gas. So it's a way to manufacture natural gas.
Interesting.
That's the way to think of it. And it's a nasty, dirty process. And diesel tanks and all kinds of infrastructure for it. They did their own work to comply with a redevelopment agency in the project. So I did all the other 19 city blocks.
And that's historically, that land was historically used for many, many different things, because back then people didn't really think about the environmental impact. They thought, okay, I've got something dirty, just going to huck it in the backyard. It wasn't thought of, oh, I should properly dispose of this. It was just, that was what was done.
Yeah,
it wasn't,
the area south of K Street was mostly manufacturing and what I would call light industrial of some sort. North of K Street was more residential, hotels, saloons, restaurants, laundries, that kind of thing.
Okay.
But the point that you're touching on was the big revelation of the work was that in the 1800s and early 1900s, buildings were built smaller than the lot because they needed a back lot. And in the back lot, they had their privy before indoor plumbing. They had at least down San Diego, they had we call them dry wells. They're generally 4 feet in diameter, drilled, sometimes lined with brick, sometimes not. That's how they got rid of the wastewater.
Oh, okay.
In the old city records, they're called cesspools. A lot of properties had cisterns, anywhere from 6 feet deep, 6-foot diameter to 18 feet in diameter and 20 feet deep. Was I think was the biggest one I found. And they would get water from horse-drawn wagons delivered, filled it up, and that would be their potable water. But then when the water mains first went in, those weren't needed, and they became trash pits. Or some turned them into oil tanks, and they weren't very good oil tanks.
I'm sure they were liquid tight.
Yeah, that very big one I was talking about was turned into a oil tank for, at the time, the biggest hotel in San Diego.
Oh, wow.
And it all leaked out all the walls.
Yeah.
So all those things were deposits. Oh, and backyard trash burning.
Yeah, very common. Very common up until I believe the mid-50s. Or was it later than that?
Well, it's in LA is, we're going to sidetrack here, but LA, it was a hotbed of using backyard incinerators. These were above ground, like cast iron incinerator with a little chimney.
Yeah, I've seen those.
Right. Okay. They were all over LA, and it's actually one of the primary reasons the air quality management district was created to battle the smog in LA. And one of the first things they did was ban those.
Well, yeah, because particulate matter pollutants, the little things.
Right. But I don't hear any discussion of the issue about what happened to the ash.
Buried.
Well, people aren't going to tidy it up and then send it off because people thought it was good for their flower beds.
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
Or their gardens, or they just dug a hole in the back and bury it because you can't just leave it in the, it'll fill up the incinerator if you just leave it there. And actually, I'm working on a site right now up in Pasadena, and the fire department record is littered with violations and inspections of these things.
Oh, really?
So I have found no record of those in San Diego.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's all been literally just pits in the backyard dug and trash burned in them, or barrels maybe. But so when redevelopment first happened in San Diego, say 1930s, 40s,
yeah,
those buildings that were smaller than the lots got raised, and then they would grade the lot line to lot line.
Yeah, and build over the whole
which means cutting off the tops of the privies, the cisterns, the cesspools, and spreading that all around.
So that's
anywhere from 6 inches, anywhere from 6 inches to 4 feet. You'd find this contaminated fill, not brought in fill, just reworked material that was there. That's just loaded with lead and other contaminants from the
just spread all.
And then when you slice that off, then you find the deeper pits and the cisterns and everything that they just chop the tops off and may or may not fill the voids.
Oh, fabulous.
The one with the big cistern, I got called to that site because they didn't have any environmental work done on it, and they started pulling a parking lot off of it, and they saw, you know, a hole caved in.
So hence the name, the pitfalls of not doing a
Yeah.
proper environmental site assessment, which is what Chris does.
Right.
I mean, if you're going to do ESA or phase one cheaply, they may have missed all of that because they didn't do the research. They didn't do the homework, like what Chris was saying with going and looking up the violations, going and doing the research and the paper trails. That's what you're paying for, is to avoid these things. This is what Chris does.
Yeah, that property was owned by a healthcare company, and they'd owned it for decades. And prior to it, it was a hotel, which had a fire circa 1950 or 58-ish, I can't remember. And it was decided it was too costly to meet code because it was built in the late 1800s. And so they raised it. But what it did, it had a underground boiler room with boilers and what was originally a cistern in the basement made out of brick that they turned into an oil tank that was fed by the big one I talked about, the big 20-foot one. They ran pipes from the big 20-foot one that they got filled up in the rear courtyard of the hotel, you know, from deliveries of, you know, from some tank truck, and then pipes that fed into the boiler room, into that, to run the boilers. And they took out the machinery, and then they just plowed all the burnt rubble, well, not all of it, but at least a lot of it, into this pit, crushed it down, buried it, paved over. And there's actually, we found 5 or 6 cisterns on that site. One of the cisterns was a horse trough to feed horses, for water for horses, because they had an arched driveway where you could pull up your carriage to enter the fancy hotel, and the horses, while you're in there at the ballroom, the horses could drink before exiting. But that one didn't have anything bad in it.
Oh, yeah. All the others did. Yeah. The other one, I mean, so, you know, when I did my field work, I was in Boston. And, you know, we're talking about a history going back, you know, 1700s. Boston is pretty much backfilled in a lot of, you know, contaminated issues. Most people wouldn't think the West Coast would have such historical contamination issues, and it absolutely does. And again, this wasn't because people were thinking, oh, I want to cause damage. They just didn't think about it. It was their normal. You know, this wasn't intentional. It was just the normal thing you did. And the research, the depths of research that Christopher goes into to find out what the contamination issues are. Why don't you tell some stories about what can happen if you purchase a piece of property that is contaminated and you didn't know about it? How much are we talking? Like, give us some examples of how costs have ballooned out of control when a property is contaminated.
Well,
no names.
I'll tell you. Well, so I just want to preface this about talking about phase ones and what's happened to them. They've become commoditized by national firms that use their lowest level staff to do them with the least amount of effort by using database search companies, and that do the historical records, and they buy the historical photos. They know nothing about the history. That some guy in New Jersey doing this in California.
Yeah.
And I'm not even sure how they manage to do the site visits within the budget when they're out of state, but they don't really know the history of the local area, and they don't know the regulations, because the regulations vary from state to state.
Yes, they
not only that, they vary within a state. California has 9 regional water quality control boards, and they all have different regulations and different policies.
Yeah.
You can't assume that the regulations and policies you follow in one water board are going to apply and work in another one.
Very true.
Which is nuts.
We do. It would be nice to have consistency, but I understand.
My number one recommendation is hire a local consultant, specific to your area, that's been there for been there for a while.
You know where things are.
I like to say that hiring a national company to do your phase one for $1,500 so you can check the box on your loan application is the easiest way to buy an enormous environmental liability.
Yeah, because you are responsible for everything on and under that piece of property once you purchase it.
Another way to think of that is, people know about mineral rights.
Yeah.
You buy a property, if there's gold under it, you own all that gold. But you also own all the contamination from the previous land uses.
Yeah.
It's all yours now. So for an example, I'm currently working with a client, and for a 6.5 acre property, they want to redevelop for affordable housing up in the high desert. And they kind of relied on a phase one that was done for a prior developer that was considering the site that backed out. The city was like, here, we have a phase one. And then they said, okay, look, the phase one says there's no real issues. I did a 2-3 hours worth of historical research from here at home and found a whole list of historical land uses that needed to be assessed.
Yeah.
I've actually acted as like a manager for them, and we put it out to bid because it was going to be a really big, lot amount of work. And they've spent $500,000 on 2 phase 2 so far. And now we have discovered a solvent plume that's quite significant. And so now they're looking at probably a couple million to remediate it.
Yeah.
Plus potential offsite liabilities.
And by offsite, he means the contamination is moved off the property onto your neighbors, and you're responsible for that as well.
Right. Both in the groundwater, where the direction the groundwater moves, and also in the vapor, which moves in all directions. So the site is a long, skinny site with residential on one side and commercial on the other, and
2 different regs, guys. 2 different regs.
Yeah, exactly. And we're putting the top end of the liability in the $10 million range. On a worst case scenario, if those across the street somebody does a phase one over there, they'll find these documents, and the lawsuits can fly.
And the lawsuits, some people sue for the sake of suing. They just want to be paid. Other people are like, listen, I just want this cleaned up. So you're going to deal with 2 different types of people. I used to work in claims, and let me tell you, more people just want to get paid. So you're going to see a lot of those lawsuits fly. But going on to the costs incurred of just, getting that box checked. Yes, I did a phase one. It was done poorly, resulting in estimate $10 million in remediation and damages, not including the lawsuits that will probably come as well. You actually sparked a memory I had of when I worked in one of my first underwriting jobs. I was talking to a person, and they had just bought, it was just a regular old firm. They bought a town, and I'm like, you bought a town? How very interesting. Because they wanted to buy insurance.
The entire town.
The entire town. They wanted to buy insurance called pollution legal liability, which is property insurance for the pollution. And I'm like, well, who'd you buy the town from? Where's the phase one report? It's like, oh no, we couldn't do a phase one report. It was sold to us by the Department of Defense. It used to be a military base. Right. So Chris, your wheels are spinning right now, because we all know that military bases are a little bit dirty and sometimes have some major problems. And they bought we're talking the city hall, they bought the gymnasium, they bought the schools, the rec halls, everything.
Gas stations.
Really, he didn't mention gas station, but I'm sure there's one. I'm sure there are plenty of you at underground storage tanks there.
Yeah.
But the whole point being, he was very happy that he got it so cheap. And I had to say, I'm really sorry, without even a phase one or phase two, I cannot underwrite your account. I can't do it. And they were very unhappy because they just thought it would be, rubber stamp, cover my property. I can only imagine what they found when they started popping holes in the ground. If it's too good to be true, guys, it's absolutely too good to be true. You got to be careful. I mean, you and I have both seen sites where let's say a hotel has been there 100 years. They raise the hotel, they start scraping underneath it, and they find a bunch of underground storage tanks that nobody knew about because back in the 20s and 30s, they didn't keep great records.
Right.
You gotta do that. You gotta do your research. And fire departments, you look at those old Sanborn fire insurance maps. Those are fabulous. I don't know if they're digitized.
The site in the desert, that's what the phase one, the inadequate phase one said there were no Sanborn maps for the site. I went online through the library research stuff and I found Sanborns for the site.
With little rectangles.
Yeah, that took me 20 minutes on the computer to find.
Yeah.
If that. And that showed us a bunch of this. Unfortunately they only went up to like the 30s, but it was some, and led us down a road of, and then I went through the history that they had developed and found things they never called out. And, I mean, there was 2 gas stations on the site. One had done a remediation, got closed, but that was years ago. And then the vapor standards have changed. And this is the other thing that's making this more and more important to do, is that the environmental regulations have done nothing but get stricter.
And they're still getting stricter.
Since the Clean Water Act in 1970-ish, they've done nothing but get stricter. The more and more science there is, the stricter they get, and more difficult it is to deal with them. And cheaping out on a phase one to get that loan is a very dangerous move.
You can also get fined by the regulatory.
You mentioned that they bought this town with cash, and if you buy a property with cash, not having a phase one is an easy way to separate you from all your cash.
Yes.
not just what you paid for the property, everything else you own.
And you also brought up remediation systems. I don't think people understand that, when a plume migrates down your site, because downhill, migrates through your site, maybe onto your neighbors, you need a proper environmental consultant such as yourself who understands how these things work, because you want to be able to catch the plume to remediate it. And a lot of times people will put the system in the wrong site, because I've witnessed this, when I was in claims, and they put the system in the wrong place and they miss the plume, like, oh shoot, looks like we're going to have to put in a whole new one for twice the price. You don't want that. You don't want your clients suffering that.
There's a lot of, and unfortunately, there's no way to suss this out when picking a consultant, but there's a lot of consultants that poke holes, get data, and just look at the data, and they don't wrap their head around the reason why the contamination is there, how it got there, how it may have spread. And over and over and over again, I see consultants make mistakes. The Jordan Downs project, the 21-acre steel mill site, this one consultant did tons of work on the site, big geophysical survey across 21 acres. They went out and potholed for the anomalies, 42 potholes or trenches. Then they did 100 soil borings. And then they came back and said, okay, 8.5 acres need to be remediated, and got a plan approved by the agency. And that's when I came in as a construction manager, and I looked at the plan and I said, you have no logic for where you're drawing your lines between what's bad and what's good. And I reviewed their phase one and their history, and in the assessing for the anomalies, that did it 42 holes, they didn't take a single sample. All they did was look. And in there was a paragraph that said, in every hole, there is a layer of junky fill with brick, pipe, wire, slag, whatever. And they saw it in every single hole. That meant there was a layer of contaminated fill across the entire site.
Absolutely. I told them
that. And the thing is, when you look at who signed the reports, the people that did the potholing, they didn't do the phase two, the sampling. Different people did that. who probably didn't read the first report well enough. And, and the person that did the phase one, all the historical research, wasn't involved in any of that.
Yeah, consistency is important.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of firms just have people that all they do is phase ones and they never do phase twos. And the people that do the phase twos don't do the phase ones. So, you're hoping they read the phase twos well enough. I mean, the phase ones well enough.
Yeah.
Or previous reports. And
wow.
And then when they started the remediation, everywhere they dug in the first phase of it, there's just 3-4 feet of this junky fill. Of course, it's all contaminated. It was just they were smelting metal across the slag. And I told them, this just keeps going, and you need to step out with potholes and figure out where it goes. No. We have data that says it's clean. It says it's clean. It's because they sampled below the fill. So there's places where there's only a foot or a foot and a half of contaminated fill, and they sample it 2 feet and say it's clean because they didn't do any boring logs. And look at what they're sampling.
How do you not do a boring log? That's like a given.
Yeah, well, yeah, they did 100 borings on the site, no logs.
And no, so people know boring log is like a diagram you do of the sample you took and basically the boring hole and the sediment layers. It's a standard thing, guys, that you're just going to have to.
And you figure out the lithology of what you. And the thing that they should have figured out is what was fill and what was native, never disturbed soil.
Yeah.
And they didn't. So they didn't know if they were sampling below the contamination or not. And so in the end, they eventually, the agency said, no, you have to go figure the rest of this out before we continue. So they had to do 140 potholes.
Oh, Lord.
And came back, and 20.5 acres out of the 21 had to be dug up and cleaned up. 250,000 tons.
Soil excavation? That's expensive.
So it went from an $8.5 million estimate to $33 million.
Yeah.
Because of those mistakes.
And that's the whole point of this conversation, is to educate and tell people you gotta mitigate your risk. And that's the best way I can put it. Know what, if you're going to buy something, do a proper phase one, do a proper environmental site assessment, hire, someone like Chris who's local to your area, who has the knowledge of the history of the area, that knows, okay, so this is my backyard. This is where I've lived. I know everything that's happened in my neighborhood. And I can also know where to find those, like the Sanborn maps. I was in the field at 22, and it was my favorite part was looking at Sanborn maps. I found them fascinating. But everyone who's an environmental consultant knows that they exist. It's a rarity to not have a Sanborn fire insurance map.
Well, there is. I mean, not every.
I'm talking East Coast was where I was.
I mean, they are almost always present in older parts of cities. Yeah. They're not going to be out in the new suburb that was built.
No. But this gave you the history to know.
It's all in the older areas of cities and.
Yeah, I had one site. It was so the area was completely grassed over and empty. Pulled out the maps. There used to be a railroad turnstile there, meaning the old steam or coal power railroads, the engine would turn like it's on a record player disc. That's how they'd turn it around to get it going back again. Loaded with oil. Those things, it's all greased up because it's got to move. Loaded with oil. You would have, from looking at it, open field. Right. You saw nothing.
Well, they also do maintenance on the train.
Yeah, so there was tons of crap and salt. Basically, once we punched holes in the ground, we found a lot of stuff. Yeah. But when you look at it and when you walk around, you don't see it. That's why you need to do that research, that investigation that's so important. And ultimately keeping your costs down, because if you see something being heavily contaminated, you're probably going to think twice about purchasing it.
Yeah, it's really frustrating on the phase one world because like I said, they've been commoditized so much that there's these companies willing to do them for sub $2,000. Given wage increases, inflation, and the increase in liabilities for not doing a good one, phase one really should be The cheap one should be $5,000.
Makes sense.
Nobody makes money on phase ones. They're all loss leaders.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I believe you on that, actually.
For them hoping to get phase two work to make up for the loss of the money. A phase one department and a consulting firm will never make money, even with using interns.
I was one step up from an intern. I was fresh out of college, and trust me, I didn't know what I was doing.
These associate level people who are they're barely taught how to do them. Some senior person will go on their few first site walks and show them how to, well, it used to be you had to go places to do the research. Now you just order it, it shows up, you review it. But, and they leave them to it, and then they review the report at the end. But they're not, the senior people aren't looking at how they're doing the research.
Yeah.
And how they're interpreting it. They're just looking how they write it up.
Yeah.
And like I said, to have someone with experience doing the phase one and doing it the right way should be in the $5,000 range these days, and it's not. You're lucky on a complicated site like a downtown San Diego or something to get $3,000, $3,500.
Yeah.
If you have a client that trusts and understands that you know what you're doing, that the reason why it costs more than $2,000.
Well, it comes down to get what you pay for. I mean, at the end of the day, if you're gonna, I mean, I just cannot stress it enough. If you're gonna just say, I want to check the box, phase one done, just send me the cheapest one possible, you are potentially getting yourself into millions upon millions of dollars of loss.
I like to ask people, is like, do they hire the cheapest, most inexperienced structural engineer for their 12-story building they want to build? Do they really want the least experienced structural engineer on it?
Yeah, no, it's a valid point. I mean, the field has to be, and that's the thing, people just don't understand it. They're like, oh yeah, environmental consulting, walk the site, no, this is someone such as Chris, who is saving you millions of dollars at the end of the day by saying, this is what I found because I researched it and I looked into it and I was able to dig further than most people do. And again, you have that historical knowledge.
Or averted work. I did 2 phase ones for a client in the last couple of years. One downtown San Diego, one in what we call Uptown. And so vapor intrusion is a new aspect of phase ones, and you're supposed to consider that. And there's a guidance on what is considered a distance for you to be considered as a critical difference for petroleum and one for a different one for solvents. One of them had a big tank. It was 4 big 10,000-gallon tanks across the street on the next block over. Big release, remediation, etc., and a bunch of assessment. Barely enough data to make a decision on it, but I was able to plow through all that data. And most consultants don't, in order to do a sub 2000 phase one, they won't review regulatory files anymore.
Really?
Nope. They say that's extra. They'll say, we recommend you review the regulatory files for these sites. Oh, pay us to go do that. And what used to be normal in a phase one to do those things is now extra.
Yeah, I used to spend hours this was before everything was online, but I used to spend hours in the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection pulling files and just reading and Xeroxing.
For the 36 block phase one for the ballpark, myself and someone working for me on the project spent 2 8-hour days reviewing the files.
I believe it.
That's 4 days worth of people pouring through the files for all those blocks. Anyway, so I went ahead and reviewed the data, and I was able to conclude that it was beyond the critical distance per ASTM. And they're okay. The other one, I found across a little like 25-foot wide alley, there was a dry cleaner in the record. It was only, so ASTM only requires every 5 years. It was only in 1 year.
Oh.
And it was in a really small space. So I went and got the city directories and went year by year between the 10 years that it didn't show up, from 5 years before and 5 years after. And I found it was only there for like 3, maybe 4 years. But the weird thing was, is that while looking through all that, I found other dry cleaners with the same name.
How interesting.
And one of them was about 3 miles down the street. And I actually had seen that before writing a proposal for a different phase one. And that was a big facility. Took up half the block. And this one was a little tiny, like 1,500 square foot retail thing.
Yeah.
So by doing all that research, I was able to say it was highly likely that this was just a drop-off point and not actually having the dry cleaning equipment there, because it was kind of too small. It was too small to have the dry cleaning equipment there.
Yeah.
So, and this is common today. There's small retail, what you think is the dry cleaner, and they just take your clothes and they send it off to a facility in an industrial park, clean your clothes and bring them back.
Yeah.
And let you know they're there. Same sort of thing, as the same name of the company, bigger facility 3 miles away. And it was only there 3, 4 years. I said, if you want a higher degree of confidence, you can poke some holes. But this is my conclusion.
Yeah.
That this isn't an issue. So the easy route for a consultant to do is, oh, you had a dry cleaner 30 feet away. You got to do a soil vapor survey. That's what most would do. They wouldn't bother to consider the size, the length of time, or that it was probably a drop off for the larger one down the street.
No, absolutely. And you
So
save them a lot of money.
I did enough research to tell them they didn't need a phase 2.
Yeah.
Instead of going to the auto answer of, vapor plume nearby possible, you got to do soil vapor survey. So,
and that's expensive. Those are not cheap.
So the value of the phase 1 is not just finding problems. It's also finding enough about the history to say there isn't a problem.
Yeah.
And that's maybe more important.
Well, if someone's buying property, yeah. If they, with the transaction, they absolutely want to make sure, one, should I or should I not invest in this? And two, what are the risks so I can manage my risk?
Yeah, they get caught up in the deal and they want to make the deal happen at all costs because they have all these grand visions of what they want to do with their property, and they don't want bad news. I say it often. Environmental consultants and the list of people you want to hire, it goes undertaker, tax collector, and environmental consultant.
Yeah, but we have gotten more important in the past few years. I mean,
yeah,
it's a necessary evil.
Sophisticated, developers understand the value. Newer developers generally don't.
Yeah.
And real estate people that just buy and exchange properties don't. Yeah.
No, because they just want to buy and sell very quickly. And well, it's kind of like flipping, but a little bit more complicated than that. But so, Christopher, how do people find you? Because I mean, obviously, you are an expert in what you do, and you are working for the benefit of the person. You want to make sure that you give them the best quality report possible, so they don't have those later headaches.
Right. Well,
you are based in San Diego, but what's your range? How far can you work?
Well, if they want to pay me, I can work anywhere.
Valid point.
But it's I can't compete for work too far away.
Yeah.
I have done work back with a former company. I did some more, phase one kind of stuff, and coming up with plans for properties up, in San Francisco and actually Oakland, and my work on my own has taken me up to as far as Pasadena, north end of LA, and I may get involved with a project up in Santa Barbara with someone that gave me a call.
Very cool.
So I know the California regulations well.
Yeah.
Going outside the state requires effort to get up to speed on those regulations. So I tend, not to chase work, in Arizona or Nevada or whatever, because people should hire local.
No, they should, and it makes sense because that's where the expertise lies, especially
Right.
with the historical information is what these are based on.
Right, and the regulatory environment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, the regulations. I mean,
it's greatly different in every state.
Oh, I remember.
So, as far as finding me, I'm on LinkedIn.
Yes.
You can just look up my name or the company here. Our website is www.𝑐SpenglerStrategies.com, or my phone number 619-733-8803. My contact info is on my LinkedIn page. Like my real contact information, not just a link to the LinkedIn page.
I've seen that happen. Yeah.
I actually have my real contact information there. It's Chris@𝑐SpenglerStrategies.com.
Easily found. No, you are easily found, because I found you rather easily when we connected, and I do appreciate when you reached out to me saying, hey, let's talk about the pitfalls of doing a bad phase one, because most people don't realize just how bad it can be for you if you cheap out on it. You're gonna have quite a bit of loss, and please, just always your due diligence. Do a proper phase one.
Right.
It's so important. And so Christopher, thank you for your time. I know you are very busy because you have quite a few phase ones and clients that you respond to. So thank you for your time this morning. And on that, guys, I'm Wendy Nystrom, your host with Environmental Social Justice. Please check out Spengler Strategies. He does good work. He's going to help you guys save in the long run. Just do it right the first time, please. Please. We'll talk to you guys later. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.